Magnetic media time, this time on ChinnyVision. What's the thing you hear from most people when they say you collect old computers? I had the one with the colourful keys, or perhaps I had the Sinclair 64. But think further, how long before any conversation with a non-believer turns to the subject of cassette tapes? They say things like, games took an hour to load, they never worked, the cassette got all tangled up in the player. And if you're having a wider conversation about cassette tapes, the subject may turn to the fact they were poor quality and they weren't as good as CDs. I've had several conversations like this in recent weeks, and I've decided to investigate why people have these opinions and look at cassettes and see if they're as bad as people think. The compact cassette was invented by Philips in 1963 and consists of a magnetic tape in a plastic case. The tape itself is basically metal oxide glued onto a thin piece of plastic. Running time is typically between 5 to 45 minutes. The longer the tape, the thinner it needs to be, the less reliable it becomes, and the more strain on the motor. You get the idea. Early in its life, audio quality was poor, but it improved vastly by the 1970s and continued to advance. Originally, cassettes were formulated from ferric oxide, like this one here, and they later progressed to things like chrome, here's a Sony realistic super tape, through to metal formulations, and here's a TDK MA50. That's quite expensive. You also had innovations such as Dolby B, C and HX Pro, which introduced lower noise and ushered in an era of hi-fi sound in the home. Back in the world of computers, cassettes started to be used for data storage in the early 1970s. Magnetic tape had been the staple of computing storage for many years, so it was logical that the maturing medium of the compact cassette could be used for low-cost storage. By the mid-70s, the Kansas City standard was agreed, and many early microcomputers used this to record data to cassette tape. In Europe, machines such as the BBC Micro and the MSX used this standard. The maximum baud rate for the Kansas City system is usually 1200 baud, although the MSX can manage a theoretical maximum of 2400 baud, although slightly lower in practice. Machines such as the CPC and Spectrum use their own encoding systems. But enough of ancient history. All we knew is we wanted games. Games came on cassette. And therefore we needed a computer with a tape deck to play the games we saw for sale in the shops. And let's face it, to copy them as well. Although by the time the bulk of our home micros arrived on the scene, floppy disks were the norm on business machines, at the time in the UK, cassettes were cheap and widespread. Now, we won't look at every 8-bit computer here, but while you may think that all computers using cassettes are simply converting tones on an analogue tape to digital data, in fact it's far more complicated than that. Machines such as the CPC, BBC, MSX and Spectrum can use any standard audio tape recorder. In fact, the tape recorders built into the CPC 464 and Spectrum Plus 2 are barely any different from those in, say, an Amstrad or Matsui or whatever hi-fi. Analog tones are sent down the earphone cable in a similar way to how a fax machine sends data down a phone line. This then hits an analog to digital converter inside the micro, and the CPU then decodes this. It's very CPU intensive, hence it's rare to find a Spectrum or Amstrad game with, say, things like loading music. Typically, speeds for a machine like the Amstrad CPC can be similar to the Kansas City system, although I've heard people on the CPC forums boasting they've pushed their CPCs as far as 6,000 bits per second. Don't know how reliable that would be. Machines such as the Atari 8-bit and C64 are different, however. Let's look at the C64 as both machines use a similar setup. You may think Commodore were being difficult by putting a proprietary connector on their tape recorder. Well, there's a reason. With the C64, all that messy analog to digital conversion is done inside the tape recorder itself. The data is sent down the cable digitally. Additionally, the tones on the C64 tape system are in fact square waves, each tone recorded twice. Stock speed is slightly slower than machines that use analog transfer at 800 bauds per second, but turbo loaders can make this much faster, and people reporting 3600 baud being practical, with 7200 being possible, although probably unreliable. In the early days of all these micros, software used the machine stock loaders, But as software became larger, loading times became a consideration. Piracy was also an issue. What to do? Well, there was the introduction of the speed loader. Speed loaders are a whole topic of their own, but I'll briefly look at them here. The aim was to decrease loading times, perhaps even provide some kind of entertainment during loading, such as music on some C64 games, and also reduce piracy. Systems such as bleep load on the Spectrum and CPC were not only fast, but they had very specific timings between each block of data. If these games were duplicated on a typical cheap 1980s tape-to-tape deck, these timings could be altered, and as a result the game would deliberately fail to load. With publishers developing loaders way beyond the machine's stock loading speeds, clearly this would lead to more people having problem loading games, and indeed it did. But why did people have problems? Firstly, if you have a cassette deck on a C64, Atari, a CPC or Spectrum Plus 2, you could pop a tape in without much thought. It should be already adjusted from factory for the audio level, and all will be needed was an occasional head cleaning. But what about the rest of us? Well, in my case, the impetus to load cassette software came in March 1987. We had purchased a teletext adapter for our CPC 6128. The problem was the software came on cassette, so my dad purchased a cassette lead from the local computer dealer, and a spare cassette recorder was pressed into service. We simply didn't have a clue what to do, and there seemed like days and days of experiments of adjusting the volume and tone controls to get the software to load. We simply didn't understand. Of course, I now know you can put your ear to the CPC and faintly hear the tones before adjusting them to get them to sound as sharp as possible. But of course, we didn't know that, and we didn't know that having a tone control on the cassette player also wasn't helpful. Indeed, if you're loading from cassette on machines like this, just avoid tone controls and graphic equalizers. This battle went on up and down the country. Spectrum owners were lucky because they could hear the audio through their speaker. CPC, MSX and BBC owners had a right battle on their hands, but eventually you licked it and marked off the settings on your tape recorder in a biro that worked for most of your games. Of course, much also depended on your tape recorder. My life changed in the late 80s when I got hold of one of these. Simply the best tape recorder I've ever used for loading on the Speccy or CPC. Once it was set up, it pretty much worked for everything, whether duplicated game, pirated games, or anything else. Such a good machine, I sought one out on eBay, and even though this one looks a bit battered, it's as good as new. All it's had is a tape head clean. No new belts, nothing. Not attractive to look at, I know, but it works. And here we move on to another critical factor that impacted you if you had an internal tape deck or external tape deck or Commodore or Atari tape deck. Duplication quality. Computer games were usually duplicated onto the cheapest type of cassette available, ferric oxide. Now, for the limited audio frequencies these machines use, this isn't a problem. But even among these cheap type of cassettes, there was good quality and bad quality. Let's take a moment to look at the tape itself. Many things come into play with a cassette. For example, was it professionally duplicated? Was it clearly knocked up by somebody at home, like this copy of Endzone for the Spectrum, which is on it's a bit of a giveaway, W.H. Smith computer cassette with a stamp someone's bought to stamp their game name on there. Although you can see that's a nice brown cassette in there with a shiny surface, so presumably W.H. Smiths knew what they were doing. But there's more to it than that. What about the cassette housing, for example? Does the tape move freely? Is it a good quality of cassette in there? Did they skimp on the media? Here we have a Mastertronic cassette, Mad Games. Usually, the ones from this era say using BASF tape, but this one doesn't. Nice brown cassette in there, although it looks a little bit textured. That could be age. A cheaper tape can have a weaker signal with a higher noise. For example, it can stretch. It may not adhere well to the plastic backing. I had a copy of Hard Driving for my CPC that after about a year of use, the brown oxide layer started flaking away from the tape backing so you could see through. And I had to make my own pirate copy by using the B side and then the A side to get what I needed off it to avoid the damage section. It was really weird. Never had that happen before. So that's part one of this video. I'm going to split it up. In part two, we're going to look at the actual real world performance of cassettes on the tapes you were actually buying.